Thank you for the introduction. My name is Masato TADANO of Hitotsubashi University, and I'll be your facilitator today. I specialize in constitutional law, particularly in parliamentary systems, electoral systems, representative democracy. I focus on comparative studies with the French Constitution because it is rich in materials for discussion on political systems. For today's symposium, we have invited Mr. Mark Sweeney, Principal Deputy Librarian of the U.S. Library of Congress, as the lecturer. We have also invited speakers from Japan who are well-versed in libraries. I would like to begin by briefly explaining why a specialist in constitutional law like myself is acting as the facilitator for this symposium. The National Diet Library was founded in 1948, modeled after the Library of Congress in the United States, to serve as a national library and as an agency to assist the Diet, the legislative body. In 1946, the Imperial Diet, which was debating the revision of the Constitution, discussed the need for an organization to assist the newly created Diet in its legislative functions. The House of Representatives resolution calling for the establishment of a national library reconsidered the irrational policy decisions and legislation made by the military and bureaucracy during the war. It stated that the library must be an effective working library for the government of the nation. Behind these discussions were reflections on policy decisions and legislation that were not based on rational grounds and on a weak parliament that could not adequately exercise its legislative powers. In 1848, the National Diet Library Act was passed. The person who spearheaded the passage of the National Diet Library Act was, you may know, Goro Hani, a historian and member of the House of Councillors. Hani's philosophy underlying the library was "Truth will set us free." These words were placed in the preamble to the National Diet Library Act, and they are still inscribed above the counter of the NDL. You may have seen the inscription. From the very beginning, it was strongly expected that the NDL would assist the National Diet in its legislation through reliable research and analysis and the provision of accurate information based on its expertise and ample information resources. With such historical background, in 2008, as a researcher of parliamentary systems, I was given the opportunity to give a lecture on legislative assistance at the Symposium celebrating the 60th anniversary of the National Diet Library. I am honored to also serve as a facilitator of this symposium. In the process of materializing the concept of the NDL, Japan invited a delegation from the United States from the end of 1947 to the beginning of 1948. One of the members of the delegation was the chief assistant librarian of the LOC at the time, Mr. Werner Klapp. Mr. Klapp also worked with Hani, who envisioned the National Diet Library Act and preamble. So we feel it is very significant to have Mr. Sweeney, the Principal Deputy Librarian of the LOC, at this symposium as we look to the future of the NDL. Now then, let me explain how today's panel discussion will proceed. In the first half of the panel, each panelist will ask questions to Deputy Sweeney about the LOC's initiatives, and then he will give his response to each. Based on the answers, the panelists will make suggestions to the NDL. In the later half of the session, Mr. YAMAJI, Deputy Director General of the NDL, will comment on the proposals made by the panelists in the first half. Deputy Sweeney and the other panelists will also make comments. And then finally, I will summarize the session as the facilitator. I will now ask a question to the Library of Congress. Today's theme is the society's digital shift, and I'll be asking questions related to legislative support in light of society's digital shift and beyond. Then I will make some suggestions to the NDL. It goes without saying that the environment surrounding legislation is now very different from when the NDL was founded in 1948. The rapid progress of digitization has brought about major changes in the distribution and use of information, which in turn has affected privacy and the security of our rights in various ways. The pace of technological innovation is accelerating, and it is difficult to predict what kind of innovation will emerge and how they will affect our lives and rights. And we can see this as the example of AI indicates. Also, this also goes without saying that distributions of digitized information knows no borders. In this context, new regulation and legislation are needed in many areas, including the use of information, protection of privacy, and the organization of cyberspace. However, it is becoming increasingly difficult to control rapidly changing and sophisticated technologies solely with the traditional approach of direct and authoritative regulation through laws enacted by the state. On one hand, a new legislative role is required, but on the other hand, the limitations of the traditional regulatory approach by law also seem to be rather evident. There has been discussions on the limitations of leaving self-regulation to companies and related industries, and the need for joint regulation through cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. The significance of soft law regulation rather than hard law regulation have been emphasized. It is even more necessary to consider an international regulatory framework. Despite this, I believe that the essence of legislative assistance, which is to provide highly reliable research, analysis, and accurate information based on expert knowledge and sufficient information resources, remains constant. However, I do think that it is increasingly difficult to provide accurate information and advice to the Diet, as many of the most advanced technologies are owned by companies and are difficult to obtain or disclose. With the advancement of digitization, we cannot deny that there are limits to what can be regulated by law in some respects. As you mentioned in your lecture, the Library of Congress holds a wide range of knowledge about information technology. Given how it is becoming increasingly difficult to respond to a digitized society solely with national legislation, how do you devise ways to assist with legislation? What kind of assistance do you think will be required in the future? We would appreciate your insights.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. While certainly, the United States is incredibly innovative with technology, I don't think you can say that we have been the best in some of the legislative or regulation of emerging technologies. Certainly not like perhaps the European Union would be a good example of that in respect to privacy. And I noted in your opening remarks about the formation of the Diet Library at the same time that a new government was being formed, and certainly that was the experience in the United States. Shortly after our new Constitution, the Library of Congress came into being. It came into being in 1800. And it was specifically to be a library for members of Congress to exclusively assist them with their information needs. Over the course of time, the collections expanded, the scope of services that we provided expanded. But with every new evolution of technology, the library has been in a position to adopt that and to use that to better serve our constituents, the primary one, of course, which is Congress. But I don't think we've obviously seen anything as challenging as the digital shift that's occurring today. And all of our organizations, I think, are struggling to be able to keep up with the pace of that change, whether it be, the technology itself, the expense of the technology, the limitations that come with it from a rights point of view, just the massive amount of data that's required in order to use the technology and the expertise. Now, the Library of Congress is not a law passing agency. However, our work providing Congress with its support. Obviously, we have a Congressional Research Service, and at the heart of what they do are three values, and those three values are, first of all, the work that they do is confidential, so they do not share that information with the general public or even other members of Congress unless the member that asked for that information or that report or that document allows that to be distributed. The second value that we bring to this is that we're authoritative. We in doing our support to Congress, we rest on high quality information so that we can advance the country, very similar to in the law for the National Library. And then the last is that the last value is that the information must be objective and nonpartisan. There are many, many different entities that are in Washington that want to advise Congress on policy, whether they're an agency that is interested in one aspect, whether it be energy, education, the environment. And most of those organizations have a particular perspective on policy. But what the Library of Congress Congressional Research Service does, and I think widely the Library of Congress is that we rest on those three values. So the question is, how do we leverage those values as we look at the technology challenges that are happening today? And what I can say is that, we are exploring, the use of AI to help solve some of the persistent challenges that we've had. So as an example, the Congressional Research Service creates summaries of bills that have been introduced by in our legislature. It's a human process of having to analyze what does the bill mean, what is the history behind the bill, what's the intended consequences, what's the status of that bill as it moves its way through the legislative process. And to date, it could be a very simple bill, or it could be a very, very, very complex, tens of thousands of pages. And we've had to do this in a manual process. And we can only analyze about 70% of the bills that have been introduced into Congress in any given session. So the hope is that we can use AI to be able to do what it appears to do, at least in a rudimentary way, to analyze this massive amount of content and to produce very quickly a summary that can be used not only by members of Congress to understand what they're doing, what they're considering, but also to communicate out to their constituents that what the nature of a bill before Congress means. Now, we're experimenting right now, and we are using some of the leading AI systems. I can say at this point, we found that out of the box, they suffer from the same types of issues that I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is hallucinations. So they will sometimes make up facts. They will mistaken entities. So the technology is not there yet for just a straight out of the box, but we continue to experiment with it. And our whole philosophy behind AI in pursuit of the legislative process is that it's very much going to be a humans in the loop process. So It involves the user to be very familiar with the tool, to be able to train the tool, and even then at the end of the process, to be able to review it to make sure that it meets the quality that we need going forward. So that's not a policy answer, but that's just to say that as we try to serve our primary constituency, which is Congress, we are grappling with the emerging technology and how we can put it to work.
Thank you very much. I think we received some intriguing answers from the LOC, who is a top runner in the digital shift. While the use of AI is progressing very quickly, there's also a strong sense that the ability of the people who use it and the skills of the people involved in legislative assistance are also called for. In that sense, I felt that the essence of legislative assistance remains consistent. Thank you very much. Now I would like to make a proposal to the NDL. As I mentioned at the beginning, I believe that providing highly reliable research analysis and accurate information based on expertise and sufficient information resources will be useful for the Diet's duties outside of the legislation. Alongside lawmaking, the Diet's critical role is to act as a check on the government. When we think of the government being kept in check, the first thing that comes to mind is the pursuit of political responsibility. In a parliamentary system, the majority party forms the government. It has long been said that this system does not always function well. There's also a tendency for legislative body itself to be centered towards the government which holds the majority. This is particularly true in a parliamentary system like Japan's, where there is no change in power. In light of this, it has been pointed out in recent years that methods such as surveys and policy evaluation are vital. Surveys and policy evaluation are conducted from a medium to long-term perspective, keeping a distance from the political conflicts between the ruling and opposition parties. In the long run, this may also lead to legislation. I believe the NDL's data resources and research capabilities can also serve as a groundwork for surveys and policy evaluation by the Diet. To give one recent example, this July, the Supreme Court ruled that the provisions of the former eugenic protection law, which had forced sterilization operations, were in violation of the Constitution. The Supreme Court strongly criticized the fact that this law had imposed serious hardship on people with certain disabilities for 48 years. Prior to this ruling, in June 2023, the Diet compiled a detailed investigative report on the matter. I think it is significant that the Diet has taken a direct approach to investigating a law that has led to serious human rights violations for half a century. The NDL has actually cooperated in the investigation of the history of the former eugenic protection law and legislation in other countries. In similar manner as the public health crisis brought by COVID-19, there are many other issues that require in-depth research from a broader perspective, rather than just investigating individual points of contention. Of course, there are also a number of research studies published by the NDL that take a broader perspective, rather than just analyzing individual policy issues. I believe that the NDL, as the National Diet's primary information resource, is expected to make further contributions to the Diet's medium to long-term research and policy evaluation through such surveys. So that is my suggestion, or rather a request, and I would like to hear the response from Deputy Director YAMAJI in the later half of the panel discussion.
Next, I'd like to invite Dr. KITSUREGAWA to ask any questions he may have to the LOC and then make his suggestions to the NDL. Dr. Kitsuregawa, please ask your questions to Mr. Sweeney. My name is Kitsuregawa. I am currently the president of an inter-university research institute called the Research Organization of Information and Systems, which deals with digital matters. Before that, I was the longtime head of the National Institute of Informatics, the only organization which is dedicated to IT in the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology. I have been in my current role since last April. I retired from the University of Tokyo, but I still have the title of special professor there as well. My role today is to lead discussions on digital matters. So I would like to ask questions regarding the experience of the Library of Congress from that perspective. My first question is on the pandemic, and I am interested in how the Library of Congress dealt with it. The pandemic promoted the use of online tools in many ways. For example, the pandemic forced office workers to work from home. Students took classes from home as well. It's possible to say that human activities shifted from physical space to virtual space. Some people say that organizations that proactively embraced digital technology became more active after the pandemic, whereas organizations that failed to do so tended to decline after that. I imagine many of you can understand this. How well did Japanese libraries cope with the pandemic? Since the percentage of digitized books is still relatively small in Japan, university libraries may not have been able to conduct a wide range of activities during this period. That is the impression I had when I met with professors at 7 leading national universities. Mr. Sweeney said in his presentation that the Library of Congress has been implementing digital strategies for a long time and also during the pandemic. Mr. Sweeney, could you please tell us about some of the activities your library carried out during the pandemic?
Well, at the time that the pandemic began, the library, as you said, had already been involved in digitizing much of its special collections. And by much, I mean millions of items. But in a library that has 170 plus million items in its collection, even today, I would say that maybe 10% of our collections are available in digital form. And there are a lot of reasons why that's the case. The primary one would be we only invest in digitizing collections that are in the public domain and can be freely used. So that's our priority. But the percentage really maybe isn't really the issue. I think it's the quality of the items in your collection that you've decided to put into digital form. So we had a lot of experience. I think we had very high quality content, not always with the amount of description that we would like, but we were well positioned with digital collections that the public could continue to use. And even there, researchers in the pandemic, researchers changed the nature of what they could pursue based on what was available. So whereas researchers might have come to the Library of Congress to look at a special collection that hadn't ever been digitized, during the pandemic, they all worked online. So they changed the nature of some of their research to what was available digitally. But as I said, we already had good-sized digitized collections. We were in the process of rebuilding our IT infrastructure, so we had implemented some of the virtual tools that we could then actually learn and exploit very quickly. We deployed technology to our employees. We distributed laptops to individuals. We arranged for Wi-Fi access. In the case of something like the Congressional Research Service, they had access to our electronic resources, whether they were ones that we digitized from our own collection or whether they were licensed from other sources. So they could conduct most of their work in an ongoing way, in one way or another, from remote location. Video conferencing, all of that. But for the general researchers, obviously they couldn't come on site. But we had started to implement some technology that allowed users to crowdsource our collections to create metadata about our collections. So we were able to rely on that for not only for the public to go in and transcribe letters and to add some metadata to the collections, but we actually flipped that tool to be a tool that our own employees could use to describe our collections, even though they physically couldn't come on site. So we put on hold some of our physical processing, and we used our staff time to invest in what we had digitized, but to provide greater access through additional metadata. So that was there's a piece of technology we had never planned on using, our own staff using, but we were able to exploit it. In the case of our copyright office, we made some emergency changes in the requirements. The library at the time primarily required a physical deposit of a book or a work, and that's when we began to allow registration of digital versions of the book instead of, or whatever the work was. And that allowed them to process the registrations, provide the certificates, and that really began our process of thinking of how are we going to move from a print first to what we now call e-preferred. So we started working our processes there. So, obviously a lot of remote work. Another example would be our National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. There we work in a network with libraries in every state. We had already started to begin a centralized audiobook service and to make it digitally accessible. So while we couldn't necessarily send out a physical version, we had a digital service and provided that someone had access to the internet, Wi-Fi, and had a device, they could connect to our catalog and receive at least an audio version of the book. We've since deployed Braille readers, which use the same technology so that they can access today over 300,000 books that we have available, and we circulate about over 20 million of those to people who are authorized to receive that service. So incredibly challenging time, but our staff really stepped up and they embraced the new technology that we were providing them in interesting ways in order to continue the mission of the library.
Thank you very much for your very exciting answer. I would not want to ask too much of you, but since digital is one of the key words in this symposium, I am given the liberty to ask one more question, which is on a topic that was touched on earlier. So I would like to ask my question from a slightly different angle. My second question is on AI, which is on everyone's mind lately. Earlier, there was a discussion on the use of generative AI. Generative AI, not just any simple AI, is in the news almost daily. For example, just a few days ago, there was an article in Forbes magazine about the Library of Congress and the use of generative AI. Some of you may have seen the article. It seemed to me that, based on what I read, the library is positive and proactive about using such technologies. In your earlier remark, you said that your library is streamlining the processing of bills to free up time for the staff to engage in more challenging work, more difficult work, and improve the efficiency of back office administrative work. One of the major roles of the Library of Congress is that, like the National Diet Library, is serving as a storage of massive amounts of textual information accumulated over many years. We sometimes feel like we're lost in the sea of textual information. Until recently, texts were too difficult to process, so no one really spent too much time on them. Developers of AI, however, are very interested to know how many texts people have. That's their job. According to a paper published in the US about machine learning, the Library of Congress has around 10 trillion tokens of contents. 10 trillion is a phenomenal number. It is far larger than the number of tokens existing in smaller countries. The number of texts created is linked to the size of population, which is rather a serious problem. What will the massive amounts of information be used for? If you look around the world, there are many challenges, including wars, pandemics, and natural disasters. How did humanity deal with these challenges in the past? Director General Kurata said in her opening slides that the role of national libraries and libraries in general is to use the knowledge as their own. Having the ability to search for clues and offering this ability for the benefit of the users are extremely important for humanity. This is true for both the LOC and the NDL. The internet made our life easier. Search engines will provide answers to any questions that may come across your mind within an instant. Search engines are typically used to search for words that are new to you. By contrast, the Library of Congress is made up of older words. How are we going to combine new questions with past knowledge. As you know, a technology called RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation, can be used to bring new knowledge from external sources and combine that with existing knowledge without violating copyright. This could be one of the major roles of libraries in the future. What is your take on this? Processing bills is the core work of your library, but I think utilizing eternal knowledge is also an important role of the library too. Could you please share your thoughts?
That's a great question. First, I would say, as far as the Forbes article about AI and what the Library of Congress is doing with AI, I would say that our approach to AI is what we would call experimentation before implementation. So we are actively looking at how AI can help us in about 3 or 4 very specific ways. So one I mentioned was bill summaries. Can we use generative AI to help us speed up the process and use our staff expertise in new ways? We're also looking at AI to extract metadata from digitized collections or from old records. That's another way. So, improving discovery. And also in all of that, as I said before, we see this as a human in the loop process. This is not a totally solely, machine process. There has to be human element in it because we are about authoritative information. As far as the collections are concerned, yes, the Library of Congress has massive collections. And, I said 170 plus million items in our collection, but a book is one item. And inside of a book, there may be hundreds of thousands or millions of words. And of course, if that book only exists in print form, there isn't a whole lot that we're going to be doing with AI with it other than maybe describing it. So yes, we have very big collections. They're multifaceted collections. I think one thing that maybe the Library of Congress is in a better position to do than most national libraries is that we have collected universally. And by that, I mean, we've collected in all subjects, with the exception of technical agriculture and clinical medicine, because we have 2 other national libraries that do that. We've collected every format that you can imagine. We have more than 400 different languages represented in our collections, and they come from all over the world. So most national libraries are very focused, sometimes exclusively, on their national cultural heritage, whereas the Library of Congress has really tried to collect universally, in some cases more externally than internally. All with that idea that we have to be a trusted source of information for Congress, as well as the American people. So, I mean, we have a rich collection that, in theory, if converted to digital form, is something that could be contributed towards the quality of data that will be used in things like AI. But as I said, only about maybe 10% of our collection is actually in digital form. And I would expect that we will continue to be digitizing our collections for generations. But incredibly important.
Can we hear your proposal for the National Diet Library? The first proposal is, whilst the National Diet Library somehow managed to get through the pandemic, but as we saw in the recent Noto Peninsula earthquake, where there were many deaths, I don't think we can tell children to go to the library under such circumstances. When small libraries in cities and towns are going through a difficult time, I think that the National Diet Library can use its digital technology to continue to show good contents to children, no matter what kind of disaster occurs. I think it would be a good idea to include this as one of the mission in their digital strategy. In terms of generative AI, I felt that the Library of Congress has a strong attitude of avidly pursuing the technology based on what Mr. Sweeney said. I think we are no longer in an era to use technology only after it's stabilized, but to think about where we can use these budding technologies that just have emerged. The time has now come for the National Diet Library, which is the largest library, to think about. This will allow other stakeholders to learn. Of course, it is not easy to do all of this because of the competition for digital human resources, but I would like to see such attempts to be made on an ongoing basis, even if only gradually. Thank you very much. Thank you. Deputy Director General YAMAJI will respond to these points later. Lastly, we would like to also hear from Professor MIZOUE questions to the Library of Congress and proposals for the National Diet Library. Please start from your question. I am MIZOUE, just introduced. I am a specially appointed professor of Kokushikan University, but until last March I was working at Institute of Library, Information and Media Science at Tsukuba University. I would like to ask 2 questions. First, I would like to deep dive into the community aspect, noting that in the previous strategic plan, inclusive and welcoming, such words were not used, but under the current strategic plan presented today, A Library for All, such words, inclusive and welcoming, repeatedly came up. That is where I want to focus. The Library of Congress, LOC, already states that it provides services to the U.S. Congress and to the citizens of the United States. The United States is a diverse society, and from my perspective, the Library of Congress has been respecting diversity and has been working to create an inclusive environment, for example, for people with disabilities or for users in remote locations. I think significant processes have been made in providing services. If this is the case, under this current strategic plan, A Library for All, in the title where you specify for all, when it aims to serve more people, what kind of people or group does the Library of Congress envision as the target of inclusivity as a community, and what kind of services do you intend to develop? It may sound a bit cynical, but I would like to hear what you envision as communities that have traditionally had a weak relationship with the Library of Congress, and what initiative you intend or have already started in concrete terms. I understand that when it comes to strategic plan,
It is a multi-year plan, so it can be abstract. But if you could explain some specifics, which is my first point. My second point, which slightly deviates from the scope of this new strategy. In today's presentation, you mentioned an area scheduled to open next year where children 8 years and older and their families can learn how information and research can nourish curiosity and change the source. I think it is a very interesting initiative. Reason being, in the past, small children have been positioned on the periphery of the Library of Congress's user base. Then why did the Library of Congress start this project? I would like to know the purpose of this area and the background leading up to its establishment. These are my 2 questions.
Well, thank you for that question. It's this strategic plan, the welcoming inclusive. You know, obviously, the library has been open to users, scholars, researchers, age 16 and older for many, many years. But many people see the Library of Congress as an institution that only serves scholarly research. So one of the barriers is that, well, it's the Library for Congress, but is it a library for anybody other than Congress? And that applies whether you're at home and you want to search the internet as a source for information, or if you're visiting Washington. So we have an imposing physical structure, and people aren't quite sure that the library is a place for them that they can visit and they can use. So part of the welcoming is to counteract those perceptions. Secondly, as I said, we have a very, very broad collection, both from subject and time period and format and all of that. But that's not to say that we have always collected groups within the United States in proportion to their impact on American history and culture. And specifically here, we're talking about our target audience of Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, their impact in the American story, and also with materials that those communities created that tell their story, as opposed to mainstream publications where the information is, or the perspective is from an other. So those are communities we're very specifically focused on and engaging with. We know that requires that we look at it at the type of material that we collect, also the way that we describe that material, the terminology that we use, because some of our terminology is outdated and not maybe as respectful as it should be in terms of current terminology. Part of this comes from a special grant that the Library of Congress received from the Mellon Foundation, which has allowed us to invest in, as an example, our interns and fellowship program. So one of the side effects of COVID was that we became much more adept at telework. And by having that technology, we are now able to have interns from other parts of the country who can't afford to come to Washington, who can engage with the collections and the services that we're trying to provide. So that has opened up, opportunities for young people or people that are early in their career path to engage with the library, specific to some of the groups that we're focusing on here. In addition to that, when we talk about welcoming and inclusive, we talk about accessibility. So we have a large national library service for the blind and print disabled. But we can do better with our physical surroundings, making sure that we reduce barriers to people who have those types of disabilities. Our web properties that we have, upgrading them to be more compliant for those communities. So I mean, that's sort of a beginning of a discussion that we want to change the perception of the library, that we're not just for Congress, that you could have a positive experience, that we're here to collect all stories from their own perspective, and not perhaps necessarily from the dominant culture of the time. You know, as far as the source is concerned, I mean, if you're under the age of 16, you can't use the Library of Congress's reading rooms. You can access the website. And there really was very limited opportunity to do things at the Library of Congress. A couple of years ago, we opened up a Young Readers Center, which was somewhat experimental in the sense of providing services to very, very, very young readers. We've chosen with the source to focus on the 8-year-olds into the teen years, because that's the time when you've already learned to read and now you're reading to learn. So that's beginning this exploration. And we think of the source as if you really want to change the future, you have to do that by starting with a very young generation. And this is an opportunity for us to interact with this age group, inform them what the library is, what is good information. I mean, we live in an age in which people question, well, is this good information? Does it come from a good source? Can I rely on it? Well, you know, that's the hallmark of what libraries do. So it's introducing that to the groups. We also, you know, we have 1.5 million to 2 million visitors annually to the Library of Congress. And when people come to visit the library, often families are coming to the library. There's no place for the children. The exhibits tend to be a little bit more sophisticated. Some of the performances and lectures are more sophisticated. So the source is a place where we can engage with them in an age-appropriate way and provide them a meaningful experience. So it's very exciting, because this is not the groups that we've traditionally focused on, and it will be interesting to see how it's received, how our staff get involved. I think it will be a very exciting time for the library.
Thank you. I wish you all the best. Next, can we hear your proposal for the National Diet Library? As mentioned, the Library of Congress has a very strong sense of community, and I felt that there was a shift in the direction from the Library of Congress to the community, actively seeking out the needs of users outside the traditional community, including those of all ages. As for the National Diet Library in Japan, how do you perceive community, and how are you mindful of them? Particularly, the Library of Congress's program for children is educational and will learn what good information is as explained, and I would like to see this project succeed. Although the NDL also has an international children's library, to offer access to materials that are not limited to children's books as an educational program to children would be a good opportunity to children. By providing them with information resources through intellectual and research experiences, children will be able to understand the role of libraries not limited to the National Diet Library, which is my proposal. I would like to hear your thoughts.
So let's move on to these last half of the session. From here, we'll have Deputy Director General of NDL, Mr. YAMAJI, to comment on the proposals from the panelists. Thank you for the introduction. I am YAMAJI, Deputy Director General. Deputy Sweeney, thank you for the lecture. Also, thank you to Professor Tadano, Dr. KITSUREGAWA, and Professor MIZOUE for your suggestions. I'm not sure if I'll be able to answer fully, but I'd like to respond to the questions I've received as best as I can at this point, so please bear with me. Let me first address Professor Tadano's question. You suggested that it is important for the Institute to make further contributions to the Diet's medium to long-term surveys and policy evaluations in relation to the performance of the Diet's duties of government check and control by the legislature. Control and oversight of the administration by the Diet is one of the most important roles of the Diet in supporting democratic politics, and it is the NDL's important mission to assist in ensuring that investigations and policy evaluations by the Diet are carried out in a fair and factual manner, taking into account a diverse range of perspectives. Professor Tadano touched upon the survey report on the former eugenic protection law. This survey report was compiled jointly by the House of Representatives and the House of Councilors, and NDL was asked to look into the history of eugenics and eugenic movements in other countries and the policies of sterilization and so forth. We were honored to be asked to participate in such a survey and to achieve the results that were expected of us and to receive recognition for our work. Although we sometimes receive themes from others as a more permanent initiative, we decide on themes and projects each year and conduct project-type research at the Research and Legislative Reference Bureau. As part of our project-based research, we conduct several surveys each year on pressing topics, including those related to international politics such as the invasion of Ukraine, labor and economic growth, and scientific and technological topics such as the development of digital society and space development. In these projects, we work with universities, research institutions, and researchers to conduct surveys and aim for high-quality results. We compile the results of our surveys into publications and make them available to the general public, hoping that they will be put to good use in society. On the other hand, the use of AI is a hot topic today. We will continue to face challenges in further enhancing our research services with limited budgets and staff. In the talk by Deputy Librarian Sweeney, he mentioned that the Congressional Research Service, the CRS, will also be looking into the use of AI this year. I think it will be necessary for the NDL to use generative AI to improve the efficiency of our overall operations and to improve our information infrastructure as well. As we heard earlier about how a bill is passed, I think it will be more appropriate to streamline the process so that less time is spent on compiling the final copy of a report, so that more time is spent on deliberation of the themes. So, I would like to consider the use of generative AI in that sense. These are my comments in response to Professor Tadano's proposal. If I may proceed. Next, we have two questions from Dr. KITSUREGAWA. First, we received a question about how NDL can do its best in the digital field when a disaster occurs, such as a pandemic or other natural disaster. Let me give an example what we were able to do in the face of an extraordinary situation such as a global pandemic. While many libraries in Japan were forced to temporarily close due to the COVID pandemic, we received requests from many researchers and citizens on how we are responding to their demand to read. At the time, the Copyright Act was amended to enable the provision of digitized materials to individuals. This is a service that sends digitized materials to registered users living in Japan for books that are out of print and not currently circulating in the market. As of the end of August this year, there were over 240,000 people who had agreed to the terms of use in order to utilize this service. There are currently 2.05 million items available for digital distribution, and while the statistics are for different periods, we have confirmed that the total number of views during 2023 was around 7.7 million. As you can tell, providing direct access for individuals who meet the criteria is a service that is conditional on the recipient's environment, but I believe it has also met the needs of people during times of crisis. In relation to digitization, I consider that the digitization of materials which has been carried out with the aim of preserving the original materials and improving services is extremely valuable in a situation where various disasters such as pandemics and natural disasters may occur. Although the process coincidentally unfolded during the COVID pandemic, I think that the launch of new service for sending digitized materials to individuals has provided an opportunity to widely demonstrate the social benefits of digitization. Digitizing paper-only publications is a task that will continue to be necessary in the future, so we plan to continue digitizing materials systematically. Another point on AI once again. Considering how old form of knowledge can still be useful today, I am reminded of the motto of former Director General Nagao saying, "Knowledge enriches us." I think that the NDL's approach to generative AI has two aspects. One is how to apply generative AI developed by other organizations to library services, and the other is providing digital data collected for the development of generative AI. Regarding the first point, the use of AI in libraries, even before generative AI became a major topic, the library's electronic information department had already been working on improving OCR, the optical character recognition accuracy, and implementing full text search functions. However, looking at the rapid growth of recent initiatives related to generative AI, I wonder if a different perspective is needed from the extension of conventional initiatives. Even within the library, we are thinking about examining the potential for using generative AI to perform tasks and provide services across departments. I think that using generative AI could improve both the efficiency of work and services, but as I mentioned earlier in the example of the survey office's transcription work, I'm also thinking about whether we could improve the efficiency of other tasks, such as cataloging. In terms of improving the service, expanding the function so that you can find materials through interactive communication with the generative AI, rather than relying on the conventional keyword search, would be a good feature to have. In any case, the discussions have only just begun. As you mentioned several times today, we have to pay attention to the risk that the generative AI will reproduce false information and the prejudice that it may present. On the second point, I will touch on how a large amount of text data held by the library is attracting attention as data for training AI. Article 30-4 of the Japanese Copyright Act states that the rights of copyright holders are restricted and the data can be used by developers if it is for the purpose of using the content for information analysis and so forth, and not for the purpose of entertaining ideas or emotions. However, it is stipulated that contents cannot be used for unreasonable requests of the copyright holder's profits. The text data in the NDL's position is data created through digitization and text conversion of library materials collected through the deposit system and other forms. There are also some concerns from publishing-related organizations that copyright interests may be unfairly harmed by the provision of this data. While we'd like to provide the digitized data to people with visual impairments and others, we also recognize that there are some concerns raised for the use of the copyright in terms of the use of data. In a matter of fact, we do need to carefully consider the recipients of the data and the specific purposes of use and the scope of the data to be provided. And those are my response to Dr. KITSUREGAWA. Answering Professor MIZOUE is rather difficult, but first let me address about your question on community involvement. To be honest, I think the reality is that we have not fully defined the term community in terms of services for citizens and the general public. However, since the provision of services to citizens through libraries is also stipulated in the National Diet Library Act, we have placed great importance on library networks. I believe we were thinking more in terms of user groups or user categories rather than communities. Specifically speaking, the users who physically visit the library have traditionally been considered important. If we think in terms of the collections, we can say that there has been interaction between the researchers who use the materials and the community in terms of modern and contemporary Japanese political history, that is, the materials on constitutional government and classical books. In terms of the user profile, I think that the important user type to consider for us is those who have difficulty visiting the library. As I mentioned in my response to Dr. KITSUREGAWA, there are some services that have been enhanced through digitization and can now be delivered directly to individuals. I think that this is becoming an even more important user type as the number of users of remote services increases. I'm not sure how clear my grasp of the concept of community is, but I'd like to introduce two activities that are typical of a community service. Through our work on making reading accessible, we are doing our best to understand the situation of the community of people with reading disabilities. In the field of digital archives, I feel it is important to have partnerships with museums, art galleries, and archives. We operate a platform called Japan Search for the use of digital archives. And through this, I think we are making progress in our relationships with communities in various fields, such as in education and the use of local materials. In terms of services for future users, the information provided by the NDL is not restricted by age, of course, but since the International Library of Children's Literature was established to provide services for the younger generation, it is only natural that the activities of the International Library of Children's Literature have focused on the age group that includes children's books. For middle school and high school students who start to have higher research capabilities, we are working to provide programs that allow them to experience research in a library setting, using the materials in the research room and information on the internet. I have actually observed that being able to find a variety of information at a click of a button has not made people any less inquisitive. There is a growing need for people to be able to research topics that do not have quick answers and to be able to summarize and present their findings. I hope that the NDL and the International Library of Children's Literature will be a good experience for young people, whether they visit in person or access the library online. Those are my final comments. Thank you very much. I think that all of the questions were difficult to answer, but I think you answered them carefully. If I may make a brief comment, it is often pointed out that members of the Diet are elected for short periods of time, and by nature, they tend to adopt policies that satisfy voters from a short-term perspective. With that in mind, I think that the role of the NDL in providing the foundations for issues that should be tackled from a medium to long-term perspective is particularly significant. What are your thoughts, Dr. Kitsuregawa? if you have any thoughts on the response given, please share. I believe the answers were very clear and concise. Thank you very much. What are your thoughts, Professor MIZOUE? Yes, it is said internationally that people who don't use libraries are in fact the furthest away from library services. I would be grateful if the NDL could also take this perspective of how to deliver information to people or communities who don't use libraries very much. Of course, I'm not suggesting to have such perspective tomorrow, but it is something to consider for the future. Thank you. Thank you for all that, Deputy Librarian Sweeney. Listen to the discussion just now. Do you have any comments to share? Or if not, Yamaji-san can also share his comments.
Well, all I would say is that, first of all, I thank you for the invitation to speak today. I've had an opportunity to visit many different national libraries. They all operate in a different context. We do some very similar work. But the National Diet Library is well respected for the work that it does and the collections that it has. And it does have a unique responsibility, in some ways very similar to what the Library of Congress does. And, you know, moments like now, when you're reflecting about what the future is going to be, is incredibly exciting. And I think one of the things that I was able to experience over the last two strategic plans was the opportunity to see how technology was changing the way we did our work, but also the need to really engage with our staff, because, you know, they have wonderful ideas about what we're doing, how we should change the way we're doing our work, and groups that we haven't served in the past that we should probably be thinking of. So it can really be a very exciting time in thinking about, you know, the ways that, you know, you can change to better serve, you know, your country. So I'm very thankful for having an opportunity to share with you what it's meant at the Library of Congress.
Thank you very much. We're pushing for time, but Deputy Director General Yamaji, do you have one last question or comment for the LOC? Yes. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Mr. Sweeney about electronic copyright deposits that he touched on during his presentation. My impression was that the pandemic was a major driver for the acceleration of digital deposits at your library. It was difficult to physically deliver content by post or by other means during that time. So electronic deposits became an important alternative to physical deposits. Is my interpretation correct? Could you please provide more detail around the motivation behind the push for electronic copyright deposits?
So COVID was really a catalyst for changes that were already occurring. So the current copyright law in the United States, obviously anyone gets copyright by virtue of creation. But if you want to register your copyright, there are some requirements. And one of the requirements is that you have to provide a copy to be held on deposit. And eventually that copy can be added to the Library of Congress's collection. So copyright is a very important way that we build the national collection. And just prior to COVID, we were already reassessing how we wanted to approach digital content in the future. So we had been focused on how do we make sure through our copyright system that we are acquiring that which is only ever created in digital form? So e-only books, e-only journals, websites. Now, they have no print counterpart. So we were very focused on that. And we did that primarily through a secondary part of the copyright law. During COVID, we realized that there was going to be a barrier for physical material coming to the library, and then our ability for our staff to be able to come on site and to be able to process that material. And we certainly couldn't serve the material because our reading rooms were closed. But the creative community, the copyright community, they wanted to ensure that their works were being registered in a timely way so that they could have their rights protected. So that gave us an opportunity to talk about, well, you know, at least for the purposes of registering their copyright, could they submit a digital version of a work that was in both print and digital form? So that began the process of the Copyright Office having a special exemption limited during COVID to supplying a digital version of a work, primarily books. Out of COVID now, we see the value in that. There's efficiencies in that. And having a book in a digital form, there's all sorts of ways that it can be used that a physical book could never be used. So now what we need to do is take our nascent processing capability and workflows that we have and scale them. So we're in a process right now of notification and feedback from the copyright community on our process moving forward to give the publishers or the authors an option. If they want to send in a print book because that's what they prefer, then the Library of Congress will accept a print book. If they want to send in a digital copy, if it's more efficient for them, then the Library of Congress has the ability to process that and put it into the collection. So COVID was very much a catalyst for that change that was already underway.
Thank you. We're really getting into it now. It's a shame we have to wrap things up. Let me share the summary of today's discussion. Dr. KITSUREGAWA mentioned that it is necessary to use emerging technologies rather than existing ones. This is related to all of the 3 key messages Director General Kurata said in her opening remarks. In terms of using technology in creating bill summaries, I felt that as humans, we need to develop skills to use it well. Also, how will we collect digital information? That will of course require new skills, but how will we also organize, store, and provide digital information going forward? It seems to me that the latter may require new technologies more than the former in the process of handling digital contents. And this ties into engagement with users. The LOC shared very inspiring ways to engage with its users. Director General Kurata also stressed in her remarks about the importance of enabling and supporting patrons to effectively use the immense information we collect. I feel that engagement with our users may be enhanced through offering such support. Finally, Mr. Sweeney, could you please give us your last comment on how the NDL should proceed in their efforts to achieve a digital shift?
I would say you just need to get on with it as fast as possible because the world is changing very quickly. So the time, I would make haste.
Thank you for the very accurate and to-the-point comment. Due to the time constraints, regrettably, we need to end this panel discussion. Please give Mr. Sweeney and the panelists a round of applause.